Tonight, let us not speak of the glorious deeds of kings, of shining armor, of triumphant battles, or of kingdoms built to last an eternity. Instead, let us journey together into the shadowed halls of history, into the quiet, lonely chambers where the crown sits not as a symbol of glory, but as a weight forged from sorrow and lead. We will explore the lives of those monarchs for whom the immense pressure of rule became a crucible that warped the mind, whose reigns were marked not by wisdom, but by the tragic descent into madness. These are not tales of monsters, but of men who were burdened by a power too great for any single soul to bear, men whose inner demons spilled out from the confines of their minds to engulf entire kingdoms in chaos and fear. So, get comfortable now in the quiet of your room. Settle in, and let the clamor and anxieties of the modern world fade away into a distant, muffled hum. Let my voice be your guide as we travel back in time, to the courts and castles of a medieval Europe cloaked in both splendor and shadow. We will listen to the whispers of history, to the echoes of forgotten sorrows, and to the haunting chronicles of these tragic kings. Our first stop on this melancholic pilgrimage is 14th century France, a kingdom of chivalry, art, and immense power. Here, we shall meet a king whose reign began with all the promise of a brilliant sunrise, but which descended into a long, chaotic, and heartbreaking twilight as madness took hold of his mind, and with it, the soul of his nation. Charles VI of France was just 11 years old when he ascended to the throne in the year 1380. He was a boy king, thrust into a world of immense responsibility, but for a time he seemed destined for greatness. The early years of his reign were filled with a vibrant hope and a deep affection from his subjects, who looked upon their young monarch with pride. They dubbed him Charles le Bien-Aimé, Charles the Beloved. He was, by all accounts, a charismatic and energetic youth, the very embodiment of late medieval princely virtue. He was known for his love of chivalry, his skill in the joust, his impeccable charm, and his penchant for grand, glittering festivities that filled the royal court with music, poetry, and life. The future of France, it seemed, was bright and secure under the rule of this promising young king. But on a fateful frozen winter night in 1393, the course of Charles's life and the destiny of his kingdom would change forever in a flash of fire and terror. The court was gathered for a masquerade ball at the royal palace in Paris, the Hotel St. Paul. In a flight of youthful fancy and reckless abandon, the king and a group of young, high-spirited nobles decided to stage a dramatic entrance. They chose to dress as wild men of the woods, figures from myth and folklore. Their costumes were designed to be both shocking and spectacular. They were clad in form-fitting suits of linen, which were then coated in a thick, sticky layer of resinous wax or pitch. Into this tar-like substance, a heavy coating of raw flax was attached, giving them the shaggy, bestial appearance of mythological savages. As the dancing and revelry began, the wild men, chained together as part of their performance, burst into the grand hall, howling and cavorting, their strange, primitive movements a thrilling, slightly dangerous spectacle for the assembled ladies and gentlemen of the court. Then, in a single, thoughtless moment, disaster struck. The king's own brother, Louis, Duke of Orleans, arrived late with his retinue. Curious to discern the identities of the disguised men, he approached the dancers with a lit torch. He brought the open flame too close. The highly flammable costumes, the resin, the wax, the dry flax, instantly ignited. The men were engulfed in a torrent of flames. Chaos and blood-curdling screams of agony filled the grand hall as living torches ran in blind, shrieking panic through the horrified crowd. The Duchess of Berry, thinking with incredible speed and courage, saw the king himself ablaze. She hurled the thick velvet of her voluminous robe over him, smothering the flames and saving his life. But 4 of the other noblemen were not so fortunate. They were horribly burned and died in unimaginable agony over the following days. Charles escaped serious physical injury, but the event, which came to be known as the Bal d'Ardence, or the Ball of the Burning Men, left deep, invisible, and permanent psychological scars. In the months that followed this night of horror, the king, once so vibrant and confident, began to show alarming signs of profound mental distress and creeping instability. It was whispered in the corridors of the palace, at first with fear and then with a sad certainty, that he had gone mad from the shock and the guilt of that night. His behavior grew increasingly erratic and deeply disturbing. At times, he would rush wildly through the palace, howling like a wolf, his tormented cries echoing in the cold stone hallways. He developed the fragile, terrifying delusion that he was made of glass. He would sit motionless for hours, insisting that no one touch him, lest his brittle body shatter into 1,000 pieces. He would often forget his own name and his royal title, failing to recognize his wife, Queen Isabeau, or their children. Once, his fractured mind became so convinced that he was Saint George, the legendary dragon-slaying saint, that he demanded the royal coat of arms be changed to reflect his new, holy identity. The physical manifestations of his illness were equally distressing. For months on end, he would refuse to bathe, to change his clothes, or to allow his hair or nails to be cut. Courtiers who once vied for his favor now described with a mixture of pity and revulsion how the man they had once called the Beloved would now wander the palace grounds in tattered, vermin-infested robes, his hair matted and filthy, a king lost in the labyrinth of his own mind. In his lucid moments, which became rarer and rarer as his illness progressed, Charles was said to be gentle, soft-spoken, and deeply melancholic. He was aware, in these fleeting periods of clarity, of his own tragic condition, and was deeply distressed by the chaos his illness was causing his family and his kingdom. He would weep with remorse, apologizing to those around him for the trouble he caused, a shadow of the charming young king he once had been. And as Charles descended further and further into the depths of his madness, the kingdom of France began to crumble around him. Seeing the king incapacitated, a ghost upon his own throne, the rival factions at court, led by the king's powerful uncles, the Dukes of Berry and Burgundy, and his ambitious brother, the Duke of Orleans, seized the opportunity to advance their own agendas. They maneuvered for control of the crown, of the treasury, of the kingdom itself. Their bitter infighting fractured the country. The power vacuum created by the king's illness unleashed a devastating crisis of leadership that destabilized the entire kingdom for decades. The years of Charles's reign were marked by increasing turmoil, both at home and abroad. The simmering feud between the houses of Orleans and Burgundy, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians as they came to be known, erupted into a full-blown and brutal civil war. And across the Channel, England, under the ambitious and brilliant warrior king, Henry V, seized on France's weakness to press its own ancient claims to the French throne. The 100 Years' War, which had been in a state of truce, was reignited with a terrible fury. At the disastrous Battle of Agincourt in 1415, the flower of French nobility was decimated by the English longbowmen, a catastrophe from which the kingdom would struggle to recover. Through it all, the tragic figure of Charles VI drifted in and out of lucidity, a king in name but not in faculty, a pawn in the games of more powerful men. When his mind was clear, he tried desperately to fulfill his royal duties, to mediate between the warring factions, and to bring some semblance of stability to his fractured kingdom. But these moments of clarity grew briefer and rarer, like candles flickering in a gale. More often, he spent his days in a pitiful state, unable to rule, unable to lead, unable even to comprehend his own tragic condition or the dire state of the realm he was supposed to protect. There are poignant, heartbreaking stories of the Mad King's gentler moments. Once, during a brief respite from his illness, Charles encountered one of his old friends, a loyal knight he hadn't seen in many years. Surprised to see him at court, Charles asked him why he had come. With tears welling in his eyes, the old knight knelt and replied, "To see you, my king, for it has been long since I last did so, and my heart yearned for the sight of my true lord." Charles, moved by this simple display of unwavering love, embraced his old friend with deep affection and wept, saying, "Good sir, you are indeed one of my loyal knights and friends. Stay with me, for you are most welcome in this house." For just a moment, the beloved king, the true Charles, had surfaced from the deep, dark waters of his madness, lucid and profoundly touched by this display of loyalty. But such moments were fleeting. As the years wore on, Charles grew more withdrawn and isolated. He was a ghost haunting his own palace, a sad, lonely figure lost in the mists of his own failing mind. By the end of his life, he was a mere shell of the vibrant young man who had once been the great hope and promise of France. When he finally succumbed to a bout of dysentery in the year 1422, his kingdom was in utter disarray. Northern France, including Paris itself, was occupied by the English. His own queen had disinherited their son, the Dauphin Charles, in a treaty that named the English King Henry V as the heir to the French throne. The reign of Charles VI, which had begun with such brilliant hope and joyful promise, ended in sorrow, madness, and national humiliation. The king, whom the people had once loved so ardently, spent his final years a broken man, sometimes pitiful, sometimes terrifying in the grip of his delusions. His sad, tragic fate stands as a powerful testament to how much the fortunes of an entire nation could turn on the stability of a single ruler's mind. In an age where kings wielded a power that was absolute, but often terribly, heartbreakingly fragile. From one troubled king, we now journey across the Channel to England, and to another monarch whose reign was also marred by mental illness. Like Charles, Henry VI was gentle, pious, and scholarly by nature. But also like his French counterpart, he would find the immense pressures of kingship too much to bear, with devastating consequences for his realm. Henry's reign was troubled from the very start, for he inherited the throne as an infant, just 9 months old, far too young to rule in his own right. Regents ruled in his name, while rival factions of powerful nobles plotted to control the child king, hoping to dominate the kingdom through him. The early years of Henry's reign were marked by a ferocious struggle for power between the king's ambitious relatives and advisors. Even as a youth, Henry was more inclined towards religion and learning than the arts of war and statecraft that were expected of a medieval king. Deeply devout, he took great pleasure in daily attendance at Mass and devoted many hours to prayer and contemplation. He was also a keen scholar with a love of reading and an interest in education. Henry would go on to found 2 of England's most venerable institutions of learning, Eton College and King's College, Cambridge. But while Henry's gentle, scholarly nature earned him affection, it left him ill-equipped for the brutal power struggles and political machinations that swirled around the English throne. As he came of age and assumed his full royal duties, he floundered in his attempts to control the squabbling factions and bring unity to his kingdom. The greatest blow to Henry's reign came in August of 1453, when the king, perhaps overwhelmed by the news of the final English defeat in the 100 Years' War, suddenly fell into an inert stupor. He became unable to speak, to recognize anyone, or to respond to any stimuli. For more than a year, he remained in this vegetative state, not even reacting to the birth of his own son and heir. As with his maternal grandfather, Charles VI of France, whom he resembled in both character and fate, Henry's mysterious illness thrust his kingdom into turmoil. With the king incapacitated, old feuds and rivalries erupted into open conflict. The simmering resentment between the House of Lancaster, to which Henry belonged, and the House of York, its rival claimant to the throne, now boiled over into outright war. This bloody, decades-long struggle would become known as the Wars of the Roses, after the red and white rose emblems of Lancaster and York. Even when Henry briefly emerged from his catatonia in late 1454, he struggled to reassert control over the chaotic political scene. By 1455, the Yorkists felt bold enough to take up arms against the king's Lancastrian supporters, defeating them at the First Battle of St. Albans. Henry himself was captured by the Yorkists and forced to acknowledge their leader, Richard, Duke of York, as Lord Protector of the realm. In the years that followed, England descended into a state of intermittent civil war, with the hapless Henry shunted back and forth between the warring factions like a precious but powerless chess piece. Whenever the king lapsed back into one of his periods of insensibility, fresh fighting would break out as each side tried to secure control of his person, and with it, the legitimacy of rule. During his bouts of madness, Henry's behavior was pitiful and childlike. He had to be fed, washed, and dressed like an infant. The once keen scholar now took no pleasure in his books and papers. He gave no sign of recognizing his own wife, the formidable Queen Margaret of Anjou, or his young son. To most observers, the king seemed utterly lost within himself, an empty vessel stripped of will and sense. Henry briefly regained his throne with Lancastrian support in 1470, but by this point he was a king in name only, a feeble puppet controlled by his ambitious queen and her allies. Less than a year later, the Yorkists struck back, capturing Henry and forcing him to abdicate in favor of the Yorkist king, Edward IV. The sad final chapter of Henry's life unfolded within the cold, damp confines of the Tower of London, where he was imprisoned by King Edward. There, abandoned by his allies and bereft of his crown, Henry's already fragile grasp on reality disintegrated completely. When informed of the death of his young son at the Battle of Tewkesbury, he reportedly showed no reaction, lost in the mists of his own shattered mind. Just a few days later, on the night of May 21st, 1471, Henry himself was dead, found lifeless in his chamber under mysterious circumstances. While the official account claimed he died of pure displeasure and melancholy, many contemporary observers suspected foul play, with the finger of blame pointed squarely at the Yorkist king. And so ended the tragic life of Henry VI, a king perhaps too gentle and good for the ruthless times into which he was born. His decades of misrule, punctuated by devastating bouts of mental illness, fractured the royal dynasty and plunged England into one of its darkest and most violent chapters. From England, we now travel north to 16th century Scandinavia to meet another ruler whose promising reign was derailed by a volatile mixture of brilliance, paranoia, and madness. Eric XIV of Sweden had all the makings of a strong Renaissance monarch. He was well-educated, cultured, and charismatic, but like Charles and Henry before him, he would succumb to a mental illness that had disastrous consequences for his kingdom. Eric ascended to the Swedish throne in 1560 after the death of his formidable father, Gustav I. He inherited a strong, centralized state and initially proved himself a capable ruler. He was a great patron of the arts and sciences, an accomplished scholar, a poet, and even a composer. But even amid the festivities of his splendid coronation, there were hints of the erratic behavior and delusions that would later consume him. As his reign progressed, Eric grew increasingly suspicious and paranoid, seeing threats and conspiracies all around him. He became convinced that his own nobles and the aristocracy of neighboring Denmark and Poland were plotting to overthrow him. These fears were fanned by his chief advisor, Bjorn Persson, a man who exploited the king's fragile mental state to eliminate his own political enemies. Eric's personal life was equally tumultuous. Early in his reign, he fell passionately in love with Karen Mansdottir, a beautiful commoner who had been a maid in the royal household. Against all convention and the admonitions of his advisors, Eric secretly married Karen in 1567 and later had her crowned as queen. While the marriage caused a scandal, Karen would prove a stabilizing influence, remaining loyal to Eric even during his darkest days. The defining moment of Eric's reign came in 1567 with the infamous Sture murders. Convinced that the powerful Sture noble family and their allies were plotting against him, Eric had several members of the family imprisoned and brought to trial on trumped-up charges. In a fit of rage and paranoia during an interrogation, the king himself stabbed and killed one of the nobles, Nils Svantessen Sture. Two other Sture lords and several of their associates were subsequently executed on Eric's orders. The Sture murders shocked the nation and turned sentiment firmly against the increasingly unstable king. Eric's behavior grew more erratic and delusional. He became obsessed with astrology and the occult. He would have bouts of wild, manic energy, alternating with periods of deep, paralyzing melancholy. As opposition to his rule mounted, his own brothers, John and Charles, seized the opportunity to move against him. In 1568, they successfully deposed Eric, forcing him to abdicate in favor of John III. Eric's final years were marked by tragedy and increasing mental deterioration. Imprisoned in a succession of castles by his brother, the deposed king descended deeper into insanity. His devoted wife, Karen, remained with him in captivity for a time, the only person who could soothe him in his agitated states. In 1577, after almost a decade in confinement, the 43-year-old Eric died, likely poisoned on the orders of his brother, and was buried hastily and without ceremony. Eric XIV's story represents a tragic waste of potential. He was a gifted Renaissance man who held such promise as a ruler, but like so many monarchs of his time, he found himself unequal to the immense stresses and paranoias of kingship. His unraveling mind led him down a path of tyranny and terror that undid his achievements and ruptured his kingdom. Traveling further east, to the vast, brutal expanse of Russia, we come to the dark tale of another ruler undone by paranoia and a crippling mental illness. Ivan IV Vasiljevic, better known by his infamous moniker, Ivan the Terrible, was the first Grand Prince of Moscow to officially assume the title of Tsar of all Russia. His nearly 40-year reign would transform Russia, but it would also unleash a whirlwind of madness and brutality upon his realm. Ivan's early life was scarred by tragedy, struggle, and a pervasive sense of insecurity. He lost both his parents by the age of 8 and grew up in the shadow of ambitious nobles and relatives who fought bitterly to control the regency. The young Ivan learned to fear for his life, seeing enemies and conspiracies everywhere. These early experiences of neglect and terror undoubtedly laid the groundwork for the extreme paranoia and ruthless cruelty that would define his later reign. When Ivan reached adulthood and took full power in 1547, he quickly set about consolidating control. Talented and energetic, he scored a series of impressive military victories over Russia's enemies, expanding the boundaries of his state. He launched a series of popular reforms, revising the legal code and convoking Russia's first parliament. For a time, his reign was marked by relative stability and progress. But as the years passed, Ivan grew increasingly erratic, suspicious, and violent. He became convinced that the boyars, the high nobility, were plotting against him. His simmering resentment boiled over in 1565 when he abruptly left Moscow, threatening to abdicate. In a clever power play, Ivan agreed to return only if he was granted absolute authority to punish traitors as he saw fit. Cowed, the boyars agreed. Upon his return, Ivan unleashed a reign of terror, confiscating lands and executing or exiling those he mistrusted. To enforce his will, he created the oprichniki, a brutal corps of secret police, fanatically loyal to him alone. Clad in black and riding black horses, they became a terrifying symbol of the Tsar's unbridled power. Fueled by his paranoia, Ivan inflicted cruel punishments on anyone he suspected of treachery. Torture, public executions, and mass killings became commonplace. He even destroyed entire noble families and towns to root out alleged conspiracies. The later period of Ivan's reign saw a tragic upheaval in his personal life that would push him further into madness. In 1581, during a heated argument, Ivan struck his eldest son and heir, also named Ivan, in the head with his iron-tipped staff, dealing a fatal blow. Mad with grief and remorse, Ivan descended into an incoherent rampage, alternately praying feverishly for forgiveness and ordering fresh executions. The loss of his son and heir represented not just a personal tragedy, but a dynastic disaster for Russia. As we reflect on the lives of these troubled kings, it's hard not to feel a sense of pity mixed with horror. The weight of the crown could be a heavy burden indeed, one that could warp even the strongest of minds. In a time when absolute power was the norm, it's perhaps no surprise that so many kings succumbed to their worst impulses and darkest fears. Yet even in the midst of such chaos, there are glimmers of humanity. The loyal wife staying by her husband's side, the king weeping over his son's body, the brief moments of clarity amidst the madness. They remind us that even the most notorious figures of history were still, at their core, only human. As we drift off to sleep, let us ponder these stories and the lessons they hold. Good night, and may your dreams be gentler than the memories of these tragic reigns. As the green banner of the Ottomans fluttered over the graceful domes and bustling markets of Bursa, the dynasty that Osman had founded stood at a crossroads. The conquest of this prosperous Byzantine city marked both an ending and a beginning, the culmination of Osman's frontier vision and the dawn of a new, more ambitious phase in Ottoman history. Under the capable leadership of his son, Orhan, the modest principality would evolve from a warrior band into a formidable state, its gaze now fixed firmly across the narrow seas, toward the glittering prize of Europe. Orhan Ghazi's long, 36-year reign saw him inherit more than just his father's territories. He inherited Osman's sharp political acumen and his innate talent for institution building. Establishing his court in Bursa, Orhan set about the crucial task of transforming the Ottoman realm from a loose confederation of Turkish warriors into an organized, functioning state. The conquest had brought immense wealth and prestige, but it also presented new and complex challenges. The Ottomans now ruled over substantial non-Turkish and non-Muslim populations, requiring a more sophisticated system of governance than frontier raiding had ever demanded. Orhan's first innovations were powerful symbols of this new reality. He commissioned the minting of the first Ottoman coins, bearing his name, a clear declaration of sovereign authority. He established a rudimentary chancellery, a state office that began to adapt the sophisticated administrative practices of both the Persians and the Byzantines. In his new capital, he converted churches into mosques, but he also embarked on an ambitious building program, commissioning new religious complexes, public baths, and caravanserais, including the magnificent Green Mosque that still stands today. These grand architectural projects announced the arrival of a dynasty with imperial ambitions, a dynasty that had come to stay. The Ottoman military system underwent a crucial evolution during this period. While the swift and deadly Ghazi cavalry remained a vital component of the army, Orhan recognized the need for a disciplined and reliable infantry force, one capable of conducting long sieges and holding conquered territory. Around the year 1330, he created the Yaya Corps, a force of paid Turkish infantry soldiers who served as the first regular, standing military unit in Ottoman history. More significantly, he laid the groundwork for what would become the empire's most iconic and feared institution, the Janissary Corps. This practice, which would be formalized later as the Devşirme system, involved the periodic levy of Christian boys from the empire's rural Balkan subjects. These youths were taken to the capital, converted to Islam, and subjected to years of rigorous military and administrative training. They were forbidden to marry and owned no property, their lives dedicated entirely to the service of the Sultan. They became the Sultan's personal troops, an elite cadre of slave soldiers whose loyalty was, in theory, absolute, as they owed their position, their training, and their very lives to him and him alone. What might seem cruel to modern sensibilities was, in the context of the time, often viewed as a remarkable opportunity for social advancement. Many families willingly gave their sons to the system, knowing it offered a path to immense power and influence that was otherwise unattainable for a Christian peasant. The Janissaries, with their fierce discipline and mastery of firearms, would evolve into one of history's most formidable fighting forces and the very backbone of Ottoman military might for centuries to come. While consolidating his Anatolian holdings, Orhan kept a watchful eye on the developments across the narrow seas in Europe. The Byzantine Empire, though a shadow of its former glory, still held the magnificent city of Constantinople and significant territories in the Balkans. But Byzantine politics had become a snake pit of dynastic rivalries and devastating civil wars. In 1346, one of the claimants to the Byzantine throne, John VI Kantakouzenos, locked in a bitter struggle with his rivals, made a fateful and desperate decision. He sought Ottoman military assistance, and to seal the alliance, he offered Orhan the hand of his own daughter, Theodora, in marriage. This Byzantine invitation, born of weakness and desperation, provided the very opportunity the Ottomans had been waiting for. In 1354, a powerful earthquake struck the region, fortuitously damaging the walls of several Byzantine fortresses along the Dardanelles Strait. Orhan's ambitious son, Suleiman Pasha, seized the moment. He led a small force across the strait, capturing the fortress of Tsimp and then the strategically vital city of Gallipoli. The Ottomans had established their first permanent foothold in Europe. It was a bridgehead from which they would launch the conquest of the Balkans, a conquest that would change the map of Europe forever. Suleiman did not live to build on this momentous achievement, dying in a hunting accident shortly afterward. But the process he had begun continued under his brother, Murad, who succeeded Orhan as Sultan in 1362. During his 27-year reign, Murad I would transform the Ottoman state from a regional power into a true empire, its domains spanning 2 continents. Murad pursued a systematic and relentless strategy of expansion in both Europe and Anatolia. In Europe, Ottoman forces advanced steadily through Thrace, capturing the important city of Adrianople, which the Turks called Edirne, in 1369. Impressed by its strategic location, which allowed him to better direct the campaigns in the Balkans, Murad made Edirne his new capital, a powerful symbolic act that shifted the Ottoman center of gravity firmly toward Europe. From this new base, his armies pushed deep into Bulgaria, Serbia, and Macedonia. The rapid Ottoman advance alarmed the Christian states of the Balkans, who saw their independence and their faith threatened. They formed a coalition under the leadership of the Serbian Prince Lazar, a powerful and respected ruler. On the 15th of June, 1389, the two forces met at Kosovo Field, the Field of Blackbirds, in one of history's most decisive and mythologized battles. The details of the epic clash have been obscured by centuries of nationalist legend and song, but we know that it was a day of immense bloodshed and tragedy for both sides. At some point during the battle, Sultan Murad himself was assassinated, stabbed by a Serbian noble who had pretended to defect and gained access to the Sultan's tent. Prince Lazar was captured by the Ottomans after the battle and was executed. Though it cost them their Sultan, the Battle of Kosovo was a crushing Ottoman victory. It shattered organized resistance in the Balkans for decades to come and sealed the fate of the Serbian kingdom. Murad's son, Bayezid, who had commanded one wing of the Ottoman army during the battle, took charge on the battlefield itself. His first act as the new sultan was one of brutal, chilling pragmatism. To prevent any challenge to his succession from his own kin, a common threat that had torn other Turkish dynasties apart, he had his brother, Yakub, who had also fought bravely in the battle, executed. This act, while cruel, established a dark precedent of royal fratricide that would, for better or worse, become Ottoman practice for centuries, a terrible solution to the even more terrible problem of dynastic civil war. The seed of the empire, planted by Osman on the fields of Anatolia, had now put down deep and bloody roots in the soil of Europe. As the green banner of the Ottomans fluttered over the blood-soaked field of Kosovo, the new Sultan, Bayezid I, took command. He was a man forged in the crucible of the frontier, and for 13 tumultuous years, from 1389 to 1402, he reigned with an energy and speed that earned him the nickname Yildirim, the Thunderbolt. He moved with a swiftness that left his enemies breathless and his allies in awe. In the Balkans, he consolidated the great victory at Kosovo, reducing Serbia and Bulgaria to the status of vassal states, their rulers now owing him tribute and military service. He pushed Ottoman influence further into Wallachia and Bosnia. When a grand crusading army, led by King Sigismund of Hungary and filled with proud knights from France and Germany, marched down the Danube to reclaim the Balkans for Christendom, Bayezid met them with overwhelming force. At the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, the Thunderbolt crushed the Crusaders. Most of the captured European knights were executed, an act that sent a fearsome message to Western Europe. A new and formidable power had arrived, and it was here to stay. While his father and grandfather had expanded cautiously, Bayezid moved with the speed of a storm. In Anatolia, he departed from the patient, alliance-building approach of his predecessors. Instead, he launched a systematic whirlwind campaign to absorb the other Turkish beyliks, his rivals who had ruled their own principalities for generations. One by one, they fell to his armies, and in a few short years, he had nearly doubled the Ottoman territory in Anatolia. By the year 1390, the Ottomans controlled most of western and central Anatolia. This rapid unification, however, brought him into direct conflict with another rising power, a storm gathering on the eastern horizon, the vast, formidable empire of Timur, known to the west as Tamerlane. Bayezid's rapid conquests were matched by significant internal developments. He strengthened the central authority of the state, curtailing the power of the frontier lords. The Ottoman bureaucracy expanded, incorporating sophisticated Persian administrative models. He promoted Islamic institutions, establishing new mosques and religious schools, or madrasas, across his growing territories. Recognizing that an empire straddling two seas would need a navy, Bayezid also began to develop a formidable fleet. However, the Sultan's ambition seemed to have no limits, and it began to exceed even his considerable military skills. While laying siege to the ultimate prize, Constantinople, a goal that had eluded his ancestors for a century, he received word that Timur's vast army was advancing into Anatolia. Timur, the Central Asian conqueror who claimed descent from Genghis Khan, had already carved out a terrifying empire of his own, stretching from India to the Mediterranean. He had been provoked by Bayezid's aggression toward some of the Turkish beyliks that Timur considered his own vassals. An exchange of insulting letters between the two proud and powerful rulers made a confrontation inevitable. And so, the two great Turkic empires of the age collided at Ankara, on the hot, dusty plains of Anatolia, on July 20th, 1402. Despite commanding a formidable force of his own, including Janissaries and European vassals, Bayezid found himself outmatched by Timur's superior numbers and brilliant, brutal tactics. The battle turned into a catastrophe for the Ottomans when the Turkish contingents from the recently conquered beyliks, resentful of Bayezid's centralizing policies, defected to Timur's side in the middle of the fighting. The battle became a rout. Bayezid himself, the Thunderbolt, was captured. According to legend, he was kept in a gilded cage at Timur's court, a fallen eagle for the great conqueror to display, until his death in captivity the following year. The Battle of Ankara was an apocalyptic event that nearly destroyed the nascent Ottoman state. Timur, having shattered its armies, did not conquer the Ottoman lands himself, but he did something almost as devastating. He reinstated the independent Turkish beyliks that Bayezid had conquered. He then divided the remaining Ottoman territory in Anatolia among Bayezid's surviving sons. After Timur's departure, the Ottoman realm descended into a devastating civil war, a period known as the Interregnum or Fetret Devri. For 11 long years, from 1402 to 1413, Bayezid's sons fought each other for supremacy, threatening to undo a century of Ottoman state building and dissolve the empire back into the chaos from which it had sprung. From this fratricidal struggle, one of Bayezid's sons, Mehmed I, eventually emerged victorious. He was a man of a very different temperament than his father. Where Bayezid had been a thunderbolt, Mehmed was a patient weaver. With immense patience, diplomatic skill, and military acumen, he set about stitching the shattered empire back together. He reasserted Ottoman control over both the Anatolian and European territories, piece by painful piece. Though he was forced to accept the independence of some beyliks and acknowledge the suzerainty of Timur's successor over parts of Anatolia, by the time of his death in 1421, Mehmed had stabilized the Ottoman state. He had healed its deepest wounds and laid the groundwork for a renewed expansion. His son, Murad II, inherited a recovered but still vulnerable empire. Throughout his 3 decades at the helm, from 1421 to 1451, Murad continued his father's patient work of consolidation. He fought to secure Ottoman borders, reasserting authority over rebellious vassal states in the Balkans and gradually reabsorbing the independent Turkish beyliks in Anatolia. In Europe, he faced determined resistance from formidable Christian leaders like János Hunyadi of Hungary and Skanderbeg of Albania. Though perhaps less celebrated than the great conquerors who came before and after him, Murad's patient, Steady leadership was crucial for the Ottoman recovery. The Byzantine Empire, meanwhile, had been reduced to little more than Constantinople and its immediate surroundings, a ghost of its former self, surviving primarily because the Ottomans had been distracted by their own internal and external challenges. In 1444, a new Hungarian-led crusade threatened Ottoman control of the Balkans, but Murad decisively defeated this force at the Battle of Varna, ending the last serious European attempt to roll back Ottoman conquests for some time. In 1451, Murad II died and was succeeded by his 19-year-old son, Mehmed II. The young sultan had already demonstrated both a fierce intelligence and a chilling ruthlessness during two brief periods when his father had temporarily abdicated the throne. Now, in full and undisputed power, Mehmed turned his attention and the full might of his restored state to the prize that had eluded his ancestors. He was a young man possessed by a single, all-consuming obsession: Constantinople. The Turks called the city the Red Apple, the ultimate symbol of worldly power. It stood as both the symbolic heart of Eastern Christianity and the most strategically valuable city in the known world. What his great-grandfather Bayezid had attempted in haste and arrogance, Mehmed would now achieve through cold, brilliant, and meticulous preparation. The stage was set. A new chapter in world history was about to be written in blood and fire. The fall of Constantinople would mark both the definitive end of the thousand-year Byzantine Empire and the true beginning of a new Ottoman Golden Age. The city stood as it had for over a millennium, its massive, legendary walls rising defiantly above the shimmering waters where Europe and Asia almost touch. Constantinople, ancient Byzantium, had withstood countless sieges throughout its long and storied history. Founded by Constantine the Great in 330 AD as the eastern capital of the Roman Empire, it had endured when Rome itself had fallen. Through wars, plagues, crusades, and civil strife, the Queen of Cities had survived, guarding the priceless treasures of classical civilization within its libraries and churches. But now, in the spring of 1453, Constantinople faced its greatest and final challenge. The last emperor of Byzantium, Constantine XI Palaiologos, a man of quiet courage, commanded a force of barely 7,000 defenders to hold walls that stretched for miles. His empire, which had once spanned 3 continents, had shrunk to little more than the city itself and a few scattered outposts. Outside those walls waited an army more numerous, more determined, and better equipped than any that had come before. Mehmed II had ascended to the Ottoman throne for the second time in 1451. Though only 19 years old, the young sultan had already tasted power. Those who mistook his youth for weakness soon discovered their grave error. Mehmed possessed a fierce, restless intelligence, an iron will, and ambitions that stretched far beyond the conquests of his ancestors. Upon taking the throne, he made his intentions terrifyingly clear. "What my ancestors tried to achieve with many campaigns," he declared, "I will accomplish with a single blow." Constantinople was his obsession, the prize that would transform his state into a true world empire. He studied the city's defenses with the focus of a scholar, poring over accounts of previous failed sieges. He began methodical preparations for a conquest on an unprecedented scale. In 1452, Mehmed ordered the construction of a massive fortress called Rumela Hisari on the European side of the Bosphorus, directly across from an older Ottoman fortress on the Anatolian side. Together, these strongholds created what Mehmed called the throat cutter, a gauntlet that could control all shipping through the strait and cut the city off from any potential aid from the Black Sea. When a Venetian vessel defied the blockade, its crew was executed and its captain impaled, sending a clear and brutal message to those who might consider breaking the Ottoman stranglehold. Inside Constantinople, Emperor Constantine watched these developments with growing alarm. He sent desperate appeals for help to Western Europe, even agreeing to the formal union of the Orthodox and Catholic churches, a deeply unpopular move among his subjects, who remembered the sack of their city by Catholic crusaders in 1204. But the response was meager. Petty rivalries, religious differences, and a healthy fear of the growing Ottoman power all discouraged a major intervention. In the end, only a few hundred professional soldiers arrived from Genoa and Venice, along with a brilliant Genoese engineer named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, who took charge of strengthening the city's defenses. The Ottoman preparations were impressive in their scale and innovation. Mehmed assembled an army of approximately 80,000 men, including his elite Janissary infantry, Anatolian Turkish cavalry, and auxiliaries from his European vassals. To overcome Constantinople's legendary walls, he commissioned a Hungarian cannon founder named Orban to create siege artillery of unprecedented power. When the Byzantines had been unable to meet Orban's salary demands, the engineer had offered his services to Mehmed instead, a fateful decision that would seal the city's doom. The result was a monster cannon, the Basilic, that could fire stone balls weighing up to 1,500 pounds. It was so large it required 60 oxen to move, and so powerful its blast could be heard for miles. This great cannon was accompanied by dozens of smaller but still formidable guns. Never before had such a concentration of artillery been deployed against medieval fortifications, which were designed for an earlier age of warfare. The Ottoman navy, meanwhile, sealed off the city from maritime relief. Although the Byzantines had stretched a great, heavy chain across the entrance to the Golden Horn to prevent enemy ships from entering this natural harbor, Mehmed's fleet of over 100 vessels ensured that no supplies could reach the defenders by sea. On April 6, 1453, the Ottoman army took its position before Constantinople's land walls, and Mehmed sent his first and only offer to Constantine: surrender in exchange for the emperor's life and his people's safety. Constantine's reply was dignified but firm. He would not yield the city. The siege began the following day. For weeks, the great Ottoman cannons hammered the ancient walls, particularly the vulnerable sections of the Theodosian land walls. The Byzantine engineers and citizens worked desperately each night to repair the damage, filling breaches with stones, wood, barrels of earth, and even fabric. Several Ottoman attempts to storm these weakened sections were repulsed with heavy losses, as the defenders fought with the incredible courage of desperation. Mehmed, facing unexpectedly stubborn resistance, knew he needed to break into the harbor to complete his encirclement of the city. In one of history's most audacious military maneuvers, he ordered his engineers to build a greased wooden track. In a single night, under the cover of darkness, dozens of Ottoman ships were hauled overland, up and over the hill of Galata, and lowered into the waters of the Golden Horn, completely bypassing the protective chain. When dawn broke on April 22nd, the Byzantine defenders were horrified to see Ottoman ships in waters they had thought were secure. Despite this setback, the defense continued. A daring night attack by the Byzantines to burn the Ottoman ships failed, and Ottoman assaults on the walls were repeatedly, bloodily repelled, though at a cost of irreplaceable defenders. Both sides recognized that time favored the attackers. The Byzantines were running short of men, food, and hope. By late May, the walls had been significantly weakened by the constant bombardment. Mehmed called a council of war and announced his intention to launch a final, all-out assault. Before the attack, he addressed his troops, promising them the traditional 3 days of unrestricted plunder that Islamic military law permitted after a city was taken by conquest. Inside Constantinople, Constantine XI gathered his commanders for a final council. Knowing what the next day would bring, the last Byzantine emperor spoke movingly of the city's glorious legacy and the sacred duty they all shared to defend Christian civilization. Then he toured the walls, encouraging his exhausted men, before returning to the great church of Hagia Sophia for a final, somber prayer service. Orthodox and Catholic clergy, setting aside their deep differences in this desperate, final hour, prayed together for deliverance. The final assault began in the early morning hours of May 29, 1453. Wave after wave of Ottoman troops hurled themselves against the battered walls. The first attack by irregular troops was repulsed, as was a second assault by Anatolian soldiers. Then came the Janissaries, disciplined, fanatical, and determined. Near the gate of St. Romanus, where the walls had been most heavily damaged, they focused their relentless attack. In the midst of this desperate hand-to-hand fighting, the brilliant commander Giustiniani was severely wounded. As the Genoese general was carried from the walls, confusion and panic began to spread among the defenders. A small postern gate, used for sorties, was either left open or discovered by a group of Ottoman troops who poured through. Almost simultaneously, a giant Janissary managed to scale the walls near the Blacherny Palace. Once the first Ottoman flags appeared on the battlements, resistance collapsed. Emperor Constantine, seeing that the city was lost, reportedly cast off his imperial insignia and led a final, fatal charge against the invaders, preferring to die a soldier rather than be captured. His body was never officially identified. By midday, the Ottoman conquest was complete. Mehmed entered the fallen city on horseback, proceeding directly to the Hagia Sophia. He ordered the great church to be immediately converted into a mosque, a powerful symbol of the Ottoman and Islamic victory over Eastern Christianity. True to the customs of war, 3 days of looting followed. Priceless treasures were destroyed or carried off, and thousands of citizens were enslaved. Yet Mehmed's ultimate vision was not destruction, but transformation. Once the sanctioned period of plunder ended, he set about rebuilding Constantinople as the new, glorious Ottoman capital. The Sultan took measures to repopulate his prize, inviting former residents to return and bringing in Muslims, Christians, and Jews from throughout his domains. He appointed a new Orthodox patriarch, Gennadius Scholarius, guaranteeing the church's survival under Ottoman rule. Tax incentives encouraged commerce, and ambitious construction projects began to transform the skyline with distinctively Ottoman architectural elements. The city gradually became known by its Turkish name, Istanbul. The conquest of Constantinople sent shockwaves through Europe, but for the Islamic world, it was a cause for celebration, the fulfillment of a prophecy. For the Ottomans, it was a watershed moment. No longer a frontier principality, the Ottoman state had been transformed into a true empire, with a cosmopolitan capital straddling Europe and Asia. Mehmed himself adopted the title Caesar among his many honorifics, positioning himself as the legitimate successor to the Roman emperors. As the call to prayer sounded for the first time from the newly erected minarets of Hagia Sophia, the medieval world gave way to a new order. The Eastern Roman Empire was no more. In its place stood an Ottoman Empire, poised for its golden age, ready to shape the destinies of 3 continents for centuries to come. The Ottoman Empire, now anchored to the magnificent city of Istanbul, entered its golden age. The Sultan's military achievements had earned him the title the Magnificent in the chronicles of a fearful Europe. Yet, among his own Turkish subjects, he was known by a different and perhaps more profound title, Kanuni, the lawgiver. His reign was equally, if not more, significant for its remarkable domestic developments. Suleiman, working with his brilliant chief jurist, commissioned a massive project to codify and reform Ottoman law. The result was a comprehensive legal system that masterfully balanced secular administrative regulations, known as canon, with the sacred principles of Islamic Sharia. This legal framework provided clarity, stability, and a means for governing the empire's incredibly diverse populations, and it would endure, with modifications, for centuries to come. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman administrative system reached its mature and most sophisticated form. At its heart was the vast Topkapi Palace complex, a city within a city, where the Sultan ruled with the assistance of the Imperial Council or Divan. This governing body, which met several times a week, included the Grand Vizier, who acted as the chief minister and the Sultan's absolute deputy. Other viziers responsible for different aspects of governance, the supreme military commanders, and the chief financial and judicial officials. A sophisticated bureaucracy, staffed by a new generation of highly educated men trained in the palace schools, implemented the council's policies throughout the empire's far-flung provinces. The system was designed with careful balances of power. Most high officials now came through the Difsum system, owing their position and their very lives directly to the Sultan, rather than to aristocratic birth or powerful family connections. This unique slave elite prevented the emergence of a hereditary nobility that might challenge the central imperial authority, a problem that had plagued and ultimately destroyed many other great Islamic and European states. Meanwhile, the ulama, the body of religious scholars, led by the Sheikh al-Islam, maintained significant autonomy in religious, educational, and judicial matters, providing a powerful counterweight to purely executive power. Provincial administration followed a similar pattern of checks and balances, with governors appointed from the capital balanced by locally appointed judges and military commanders who reported directly back to Istanbul. Economically, the empire thrived on its strategic control of the major trade routes connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa. Ottoman territories encompassed ancient artisanal centers, producing exquisite textiles, ceramics, metalwork, and other luxury goods. Imperial workshops in Istanbul produced goods of exceptional quality for the court and for export. Guild organizations regulated urban production throughout the empire, setting standards, controlling entry to trades, and providing social services for their members. Agriculture remained the foundation of the empire's immense prosperity, generating the tax revenues that funded its armies and its grand building projects. This great economic prosperity supported remarkable cultural and architectural achievements. No figure better represents the artistic heights of this era than Mimar Sinan, Suleiman's chief architect. Born a Christian in Anatolia and recruited through the Difsum system, Sinan converted to Islam and rose through the ranks of the military engineers before turning his genius to architecture. During a career that spanned an astonishing 50 years, he designed hundreds of structures: mosques, bridges, palaces, public baths, and caravanserais throughout the empire. His masterpieces, including the Seytsad Mosque, a memorial to Suleiman's favorite son, the magnificent Suleymani Mosque complex, the Sultan's own imperial mosque that dominates the Istanbul skyline, and the Selimai Mosque in Edirne, completed when Sinan was in his 80s, are among the greatest architectural achievements in human history. His work masterfully synthesized Byzantine spatial concepts, particularly the use of a large central dome to create a vast, light-filled interior space with Islamic architectural traditions and Ottoman innovations. The resulting style was both distinctively Ottoman and universally impressive in its engineering sophistication and its breathtaking aesthetic harmony. Literature flourished equally under imperial patronage. Ottoman Turkish poetry reached its classical form, heavily influenced by Persian models, but developing its own distinctive voice and sensibility. The court supported official historians who documented the empire's achievements, scientists who advanced astronomical and mathematical knowledge, and religious scholars who produced sophisticated theological and legal works. The Sultan himself, a man of deep learning and refinement, writing under the pen name Muhibbi, lover or devoted friend, was a poet of considerable talent, his verses often exploring themes of love, power, and the transient nature of life. Into this world of immense power, political sophistication, and cultural splendor came a figure who would profoundly influence Suleiman's later reign and capture the imagination of centuries to come. A woman known to the West as Roxolana and to the Ottomans as Hurrem Sultan, the Laughing One, captured in a raid in what is now Ukraine and brought as a slave to the imperial harem. This remarkable woman, with her fiery red hair and brilliant mind, captivated the most powerful man in the world. She broke with centuries of tradition. Suleiman not only freed her, but also made her his legal wife, an act that stunned the court. She bore him several children and remained his chief confidant, his most trusted advisor, and his greatest love until her death in 1558. Roxolana's rise transformed the politics of the harem. She wielded extraordinary, unprecedented influence over the affairs of state, corresponding with foreign rulers, influencing appointments, and commissioning grand charitable foundations. While some historians have portrayed her as a manipulative and power-hungry figure, the evidence suggests a genuine partnership with Suleiman, a meeting of two brilliant minds, and a shared concern for the stability of the empire and the future of their children. The final decade of Suleiman's long reign was marked by the sorrow of succession struggles among his sons. His eldest and most promising son, the popular Prince Mustafa, fell victim to court intrigues, possibly involving Roxolana's desire to advance her own son's interests, and was executed by the Sultan's order in 1553 during a campaign against Persia. It was a decision that shocked contemporaries and which, some argue, marked the beginning of a subtle imperial decline. When Roxolana herself died in 1558, Suleiman was said to be inconsolable, his grief immense. His remaining sons, Selim and Bayezid, soon turned against each other in open conflict. After a bloody civil war, Bayezid was defeated and executed, leaving the less capable Selim as the sole heir. In 1566, Suleiman, then in his 70s but ever the soldier, died in his campaign tent while besieging a fortress in Hungary. His Grand Vizier, Sokalu Mehmed Pasha, a man of great cunning and loyalty, concealed the death from the army for weeks until Selim could secure the throne in Istanbul. He continued the campaign as though the Sultan still lived, issuing orders in his name and thus supervising an orderly and peaceful transition of power. As Suleiman's body was returned to Istanbul for burial in the magnificent tomb Sinan had designed for him, the Ottoman Empire stood at its absolute zenith. Its territories stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from the steppes of Crimea to the sands of Yemen. Its armies were the most formidable in the world, its bureaucracy the most sophisticated, its cities among the most splendid. The system that Suleiman had perfected seemed designed for permanence. Yet even within this glorious golden age, within the very structures that had brought such success, lay the seeds of future challenges. The practice of royal fratricide, taken to new extremes in the execution of the popular Mustafa, would eventually be replaced by the system of princely confinement in the cafes, which in turn produced sultans unprepared for the burdens of rule. The Timur cavalry system was already losing its military relevance in an age of gunpowder infantry. Ottoman technological innovation was beginning to slow relative to the burgeoning military and scientific revolutions in Europe, and the vast wealth flowing into the empire was contributing to inflation and economic distortions that would eventually strain the administrative system. None of these problems were immediately apparent as Selim II, the Sot, succeeded his magnificent father. The Ottoman Empire had reached heights few political entities in history have ever achieved. It had integrated diverse peoples and regions into a remarkably stable and functioning imperial system that delivered security, prosperity, and unparalleled cultural achievement to millions of its subjects. The legacy of this golden age in architecture, in art, in literature, in law, and in governance would endure long after Ottoman power had begun to wane, shaping the modern Middle East, North Africa, and the Balkans in ways that are still profoundly visible today. The Ottoman Empire at its height governed a vast territory, encompassing dozens of ethnic groups, religious communities, and ancient traditional cultures. From the deserts of North Africa to the steppes of Crimea, from the mountains of the Balkans to the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, Ottoman rule bound together lands with profoundly different histories and populations. The question of how a single imperial system successfully managed such extraordinary diversity for centuries lies at the very heart of the Ottoman story. The answer is found in the distinctive governance structures, the complex social arrangements, and the unique cultural patterns that defined Ottoman civilization. At the heart of Ottoman governance was a principle of pragmatic flexibility. Rather than imposing a rigid, uniform administration across their vast domains, the Ottomans adapted their rule to local conditions while maintaining a core of essential imperial institutions. This approach allowed them to incorporate new territories with minimal disruption, often co-opting local elites, while gradually extending the authority of the central government into the provinces. The Sultan stood at the apex of this system, embodying the state in his person and enjoying, in theory, absolute power. His legitimacy flowed from multiple sources. He was the guardian of Islam's holy places, the heir to the Byzantine emperors, the protector of the great trade routes, and the head of the Ottoman dynasty, whose unbroken male line stretched all the way back to the semi-mythical Osman. In practice, of course, the Sultan's authority was constrained by the dictates of Islamic law, by established court customs, and by the simple, practical limits of pre-modern communication and transportation. Beneath the Sultan, the imperial government operated through specialized departments supervised by the Imperial Council, or Divan. As we have seen, the Grand Vizier as chief minister coordinated this government. Most of these high officials came through the Divserm system, which created a slave elite utterly dependent on and loyal to the Sultan's person, a crucial check on the power of any potential hereditary nobility. The military was similarly structured to balance different power centers. The Janissary Corps, the elite infantry recruited through the Divserm, served as the empire's core professional army. Their skill with firearms made them formidable on the battlefield, while their presence in major cities served to protect imperial interests. The provincial Timar cavalry, supported by their land grants, provided a powerful counterweight to Janissary power while extending imperial authority deep into the countryside. Religious institutions constituted another vital pillar of imperial governance. The ulama, the class of learned religious scholars trained in Islamic law and theology, formed a distinct and powerful hierarchy, headed by the Sheikh al-Islam, who could issue authoritative legal opinions, or fatwas, even on the Sultan's own actions. A vast network of religious foundations, or vakifs, administered mosques, schools, hospitals, soup kitchens, and other essential public services. These institutions enjoyed considerable autonomy and played a crucial role in the social and cultural life of the empire. Perhaps most distinctive of all was the Ottoman approach to managing religious diversity through the millet system. Rather than forcing uniformity of faith, The empire recognized its major religious communities as self-governing entities for many purposes. Each millet, most notably the Greek Orthodox, the Armenian, and the Jewish communities, was organized under its own religious leadership. These communities handled their own internal matters of personal status, such as marriage, divorce, and inheritance, according to their own religious laws and customs. Non-Muslims, as people of the book, paid a special tax, the jizya, in exchange for state protection and exemption from military service. While this system clearly established Islamic supremacy, it also allowed for a remarkable degree of religious freedom and communal autonomy, especially when compared to the brutal religious wars and persecutions that were tearing Europe apart during the same period. When Spain expelled its Jewish population in 1492, thousands found a safe haven in Ottoman lands, where Sultan Bayezid II reportedly remarked of the Spanish monarchs, "They impoverish their own lands to enrich mine." The millet system exemplified a broader Ottoman approach to difference. A 16th century Ottoman official beautifully described the empire as a garden of many flowers, each contributing to the beauty of the whole while maintaining its own distinctiveness. This complex system was sustained by a thriving economy. The empire controlled the key commercial routes between Europe and Asia, and its territories encompassed major production centers for textiles, ceramics, metalwork, and agricultural goods. Guild organizations regulated urban production, setting standards and controlling entry to trades. Long-distance trade flourished, with merchants of various backgrounds: Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, and Jews, creating vast commercial networks that span the empire and beyond. By the 16th century, Ottoman cities had become major centers of consumption for luxury goods from every corner of the known world. This economic integration supported a distinctive and vibrant urban culture. Ottoman cities were organized around central complexes that combined mosques, markets, public baths, and educational institutions. Neighborhoods typically developed along religious lines, each clustering around its own places of worship, though commercial districts brought these diverse communities together daily. The Ottoman capital, Istanbul, exemplified this urban culture at its most sophisticated. After the conquest, Mehmed II had rebuilt the depopulated Byzantine city into a magnificent Islamic capital. Renamed Istanbul, the city was organized around the great imperial mosque complexes built by successive sultans. The skyline of soaring domes and slender minarets created a breathtaking visual counterpoint to the ancient churches that remained active for the Christian population. The Topkapi Palace, situated on the ancient Acropolis overlooking the confluence of the Bosphorus, the Golden Horn, and the Sea of Marmara, served as both the Sultan's residence and the administrative heart of the empire. Istanbul became one of the world's largest and most cosmopolitan cities, with a population exceeding 500,000 by the late 16th century. One could hear dozens of languages in its bustling markets, from Italian to Persian, Greek to Arabic. The material culture of Ottoman cities reflected this cosmopolitan sensibility. Architecture synthesized Byzantine, Islamic, and Ottoman traditions. Textiles incorporated motifs from Persia, China, and Italy. Ceramics from the famed workshops of Iznik displayed Chinese-influenced designs executed with brilliant local techniques. And Ottoman cuisine blended Central Asian, Persian, Arab, and Balkan culinary traditions into something distinctively Ottoman, yet wonderfully diverse. This cultural synthesis extended to intellectual life. The court patronized scholars, poets, historians, and scientists. Literary culture centered on Turkish, Arabic, and Persian traditions, with many educated Ottomans comfortable in all three languages. Ottoman Turkish poetry, in particular, reached incredible heights of refinement, exploring themes of love, both human and divine, power, beauty, and transience in language that played endlessly with double meanings and illusions. Science and medicine built upon the achievements of the earlier Islamic Golden Age. Ottoman astronomical observatories produced star catalogs of remarkable accuracy, and surgeons developed specialized procedures for eye operations and other conditions, their advanced understanding of anatomy displayed in beautifully illustrated medical texts. The visual arts developed along distinctive lines, shaped by Islamic prohibitions against figural representation in religious contexts. Calligraphy became the supreme art form, with masters developing styles of extraordinary grace and complexity. Geometric and floral designs, or arabesques, achieved a mesmerizing sophistication in architectural decoration and manuscript illumination. And while figural representation was avoided in mosques, Ottoman miniature painting flourished in the context of historical and literary manuscripts, depicting court ceremonies, military campaigns, and city views with meticulous, jewel-like detail. Daily life for ordinary Ottomans, of course, varied enormously depending on location, religion, occupation, and social status. For most, the rhythm of life followed the agricultural seasons and the religious calendars. The public bath, or hammam, served as a crucial social center, as did markets, public gardens, and, beginning in the 16th century, coffee houses. Introduced from Yemen, coffee quickly became the empire's favorite beverage, and coffee houses sprang up in every major city, functioning as information exchanges, literary salons, and political forums. Family life centered on the household, which often included extended family members. Though a patriarchal society, women could and did exercise significant influence, particularly within the family, and Ottoman law granted them rights to own and inherit property. By the mid-16th century, this complex social, political, and cultural system had reached its mature form. The Ottoman Empire had developed governance structures capable of managing extraordinary diversity while maintaining a remarkable degree of imperial cohesion. Its cultural achievements reflected both the synthesis of multiple traditions and a host of original contributions across numerous fields. Though great challenges would emerge in the centuries to come, the foundations established during this golden age would prove remarkably durable, shaping life throughout the Eastern Mediterranean world for generations, and leaving a legacy that is still deeply felt today. When Suleiman the Magnificent died in his campaign tent in Hungary in 1566, the Ottoman Empire stood as perhaps the world's most powerful state. Its territories stretched across 3 continents, its armies had few peers, and its culture flourished with a confident, cosmopolitan brilliance. Yet even at this moment of imperial triumph, subtle shifts were occurring, tectonic plates of power grinding slowly beneath the surface, which would gradually transform the very nature of Ottoman rule. Over the next 2 centuries, the empire would face mounting challenges, both internal and external, leading to what historians have traditionally, and perhaps too simply, called the period of Ottoman decline. A more fitting description might be the long twilight, a slow, melancholic autumn for a great empire. The seeds of these challenges appeared even before Suleiman's death. His son and successor, Selim II, lacked his father's commanding presence and military experience. Known as Selim the Sot due to his fondness for wine, he preferred the pleasures of the palace to the rigors of governance, delegating most affairs of state to his capable Grand Vizier, Sokalu Mehmed Pasha. While Sokalu maintained the empire's strength for a time, this pattern of sultanic disengagement from the daily business of rule would become increasingly common in subsequent generations. This shift was deeply connected to a change in the Ottoman succession system. For centuries, Ottoman princes had been sent to govern provinces, gaining crucial experience in administration and warfare. This training ground, however, also created intense rivalries, often culminating in civil war upon the Sultan's death. The brutal practice of royal fratricide, the execution of one's brothers upon taking the throne, had been the dynasty's grim solution. Following Selim II's relatively peaceful accession, this practice gave way to a new approach, confining all the princes to the palace within a lavish section of the Topkapi harem known as the kafes or the cage. While this new system reduced the bloodshed of fraternal civil wars, it created a new and perhaps more insidious problem. Future sultans, raised in the sequestered, gilded luxury of the harem rather than trained in the harsh realities of administration and warfare, often proved ill-prepared for rule when their turn came. This change coincided with the increasing influence of what European observers called the Sultanate of Women, the significant political power exercised by imperial mothers, wives, and concubines. The Valide Sultan, or mother of the reigning sultan, often wielded enormous influence, particularly when her son was young, incompetent, or simply disinterested in governance. Powerful women like Kozum Sultan and Turhan Sultan effectively ruled the empire as regents during periods of the 17th century, building complex alliances with janissary leaders and high officials to maintain their authority. While some of these women proved to be capable and astute rulers, their constant power struggles and court intrigues often contributed to instability in the imperial government. Meanwhile, the formidable Ottoman military system began to face its own slow, creeping transformations. The Timar cavalry, the provincial horsemen who were granted land in exchange for military service and had once been the backbone of Ottoman expansion, became increasingly obsolete as firearms came to dominate the battlefield. The Janissary Corps, originally an elite force of slave soldiers utterly loyal to the Sultan, gradually evolved into a powerful, hereditary military caste with their own deep-rooted economic interests and political agenda. Recruitment for the Janissaries increasingly came from free Muslim families who saw it as a path to privilege, rather than through the Difserm levy of Christian boys. This changed the Corps' fundamental character and eroded their unquestioning loyalty to the Sultan's person. Technological stagnation compounded these military challenges. Where the Ottomans had once been leaders and innovators in the fields of artillery and fortress design, they now began to fall behind the European powers, which were undergoing their own relentless military revolution. Ottoman firearms production, tactical doctrines, and organizational efficiency failed to keep pace with the developments in the West. The once feared Ottoman Navy, which had dominated the Mediterranean under Barbarossa, slowly lost its technological edge. These military weaknesses became painfully apparent in a series of costly wars. The long Turkish War with the Habsburgs, which raged from 1593 to 1606, ended in a stalemate rather than a decisive Ottoman victory. A disastrous war with Persia resulted in significant territorial losses in the east. Most symbolically, the great naval battle of Lepanto in 1571, though perhaps strategically indecisive in the long run, was a devastating psychological blow. A Christian Holy League fleet annihilated the Ottoman navy, demonstrating for the first time that the seemingly invincible Ottomans could be decisively beaten at sea. Economic challenges emerged alongside these military setbacks. The price revolution of the 16th century, fueled in part by the massive influx of silver from the Americas into global markets through European trade, caused severe, runaway inflation throughout the Ottoman territories. The empire's traditional system of price controls became increasingly difficult to maintain, leading to social unrest. The discovery of new maritime routes around Africa by the Portuguese began to divert some of the lucrative Asian spice trade away from the overland routes controlled by the Ottomans. The Ottoman land regime also underwent problematic shifts. The Timar system gave way to tax farming, a practice where the right to collect taxes in a particular district was auctioned off to the highest bidder. While this initially increased short-term revenue for the central treasury, it created perverse incentives. The tax farmers, seeking to maximize their profits during their limited terms, often exploited the peasants beyond sustainable levels, damaging agricultural productivity and causing many to flee the land, leading to rural depopulation. Corruption became endemic in this environment. Positions within the imperial administration, once reserved for merit-based advancement, were increasingly purchased rather than earned. These internal challenges coincided with growing external threats. The Habsburg Empire to the west and the rising power of Russia to the north grew stronger through their own military modernization and territorial expansion. Safavid Persia to the east remained a formidable and persistent opponent. European commercial penetration of Ottoman markets intensified, with European merchants operating under the protection of capitulation agreements that increasingly favored foreign interests over domestic producers. Yet, despite these mounting pressures, the Ottoman Empire demonstrated a remarkable, deep-rooted resilience. Periods of crisis and decay alternated with episodes of revival and reform. Under the guidance of a series of capable grand viziers from the Köprülü family in the latter half of the 17th century, the imperial administration was temporarily restored to a state of effectiveness. The empire's territorial reach even continued to expand in some regions. In 1683, Ottoman forces under the ambitious Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha mounted one last, massive expedition against Vienna. For 2 months, the city was besieged, and it seemed as though the heart of Europe might fall. But the city held on, and a relief army led by the Polish king, Jan Sobieski, arrived just in time. The ensuing battle was a catastrophic defeat for the Ottomans, and it marked a decisive turning point. The counteroffensive launched by a new Holy League of Austria, Poland, Venice, and Russia inflicted a series of devastating defeats on the Ottoman armies. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, which ended this great Turkish war, represented the first major permanent territorial losses for the empire in Europe. Hungary and Transylvania were ceded to the Habsburgs, marking the end of Ottoman power in Central Europe. These shocking defeats forced Ottoman elites to recognize that traditional methods were no longer sufficient for survival in a changing world. The early 18th century saw the first systematic attempts at military and administrative reform inspired partly by European models. During the Tulip era, under Sultan Ahmed III, the empire opened its first printing press in Turkish, established new military training programs, and sent the first Ottoman ambassadors to European capitals to study Western techniques and culture. It was a brief, beautiful flowering of art and openness. But these early reform efforts produced mixed results. A conservative backlash, particularly from the Janissaries whose privileges were threatened, led to a revolt in 1730 that overthrew the Sultan and ended the Tulip era. This pattern of reform attempts followed by conservative reaction would characterize much of the 18th century. The geopolitical environment grew ever more challenging. Russian power expanded dramatically under Catherine the Great, bringing direct pressure on Ottoman territories around the Black Sea. A disastrous war from 1768 to 1774 ended with a treaty that granted Russia access to the Black Sea and, most ominously, the right to protect Orthodox Christians in Ottoman lands, providing a permanent pretext for future Russian interventions. Equally threatening was the rise of a new and powerful idea filtering in from Europe: nationalism. Greek, Serbian, and Bulgarian cultural revivals, influenced by the Enlightenment, increasingly challenged the very idea of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire ruled by a sultan. The French Revolution further spread the concepts of popular sovereignty and the nation-state, ideas that undermined the traditional imperial legitimacy based on dynasty and religion. Sultan Selim III, who reigned from 1789, recognized these mounting threats and initiated the most ambitious reform program yet, his Nizam-i-Seded, or New Order. He aimed to create a modern military force trained and equipped along European lines, to overhaul the tax system, and to reform provincial administration. While he made some progress, Selim ultimately faced a powerful conservative coalition of janissaries, religious scholars, and traditional elites who saw his reforms as a threat to their privileges and to Islamic traditions. In 1807, a janissary revolt deposed and later murdered Selim, nearly ending the reform movement entirely. The most dramatic challenge to central Ottoman authority now came from powerful regional warlords who exploited imperial weakness to create semi-independent fiefdoms. In Egypt, an Albanian officer in the Ottoman army named Muhammad Ali Pasha seized power. Though nominally acknowledging the Sultan's authority, Muhammad Ali built a modern army and navy, developed Egypt's economy, and eventually became so powerful that he threatened the Ottoman heartland itself. By the early 19th century, the Ottoman Empire faced existential threats on multiple fronts. In the 1820s, the Greek War of Independence, fueled by nationalism and supported by sympathetic European powers, resulted in the loss of Greece. Russian forces repeatedly defeated Ottoman armies, and in the 1830s, Muhammad Ali's Egyptian forces occupied Syria and advanced deep into Anatolia, forcing the Sultan to seek Russian protection. It was during this period that European diplomats increasingly referred to the declining Ottoman state as the sick man of Europe, debating how its territories might be divided upon its seemingly imminent collapse. Yet, despite these dire predictions, the empire would survive for another century. It did so through a combination of its own internal reforms, skillful diplomacy that played rival European powers against each other, and the remarkable tenacity of its people. The period from the late 16th to the early 19th centuries thus represents not so much an absolute decline as a complex and painful transformation. The empire evolved from an expanding, conquering power to a defensive, multi-ethnic polity focused on the desperate struggle to maintain its territorial integrity against both external enemies and internal divisions. This transformation came at considerable cost, yet through it all, the fundamental imperial system, with its deep reserves of administrative experience and cultural resilience, demonstrated a surprising durability. As the 19th century dawned, the empire stood at another crossroads. The old methods had clearly failed, but the path forward remained uncertain. The next phase of Ottoman history would be defined by even more ambitious attempts at systematic modernization, efforts that would transform the empire in ways its founders could never have imagined, and set the stage for its final, dramatic act. This new era of transformation began in earnest when Sultan Mahmud II ascended to the throne in 1808. Mahmud approached the empire's many challenges methodically, first consolidating his authority before attempting dramatic changes. His most decisive act came in the summer of 1826. In an event known as the Auspicious Incident, he used his loyal, modern-trained artillery units to bombard the Janissary barracks, crushing their revolt and officially abolishing the corps forever. This single, bloody act removed the greatest obstacle to military modernization that had plagued his predecessors for over a century. With the Janissaries eliminated, Mahmud accelerated reforms across multiple fronts. He created a new army based on European models, reorganized the central bureaucracy, and reformed the tax system. Even his appearance signaled change, as he adopted European-style clothing and a shorter beard, setting a new standard for his officials. Though his reign was marked by external setbacks like the loss of Greece and the rise of Muhammad Ali in Egypt, Mahmud's reforms laid the crucial groundwork for what was to come. His son, Abdülmecid I, continued this work through the famous Tanzimat, or reorganization, reforms. The Tanzimat began with the noble rescript of the Rose Chamber in 1839, a revolutionary decree that proclaimed the equality of all Ottoman subjects before the law, regardless of their religion. It guaranteed security of life and property, abolished tax farming, and established a regular system of military conscription. These measures represented a profound reconceptualization of the relationship between the state and its citizens, a shift from a system of subjects to one of a modern citizenry. Behind these reforms stood a remarkable group of Ottoman statesmen, figures like Mustafa Reşid Pasha and Ali Pasha, who had served as diplomats in European capitals and understood both Western power and Ottoman needs. Their goal was not blind Westernization, but a selective adaptation of European methods to strengthen the Ottoman state while preserving its essential character. New secular schools were established, teaching modern sciences and foreign languages. The legal system was transformed with new commercial and criminal codes adapted from European models. Communications infrastructure expanded dramatically, with telegraph lines connecting distant provinces to the capital, allowing for more direct central control. The Tanzimat period also saw a temporary reversal of the empire's fortunes. In the Crimean War of the 1850s, Britain and France, fearing Russian expansion, allied with the Ottomans. The resulting Treaty of Paris in 1856 formally recognized the Ottoman Empire as part of the European state system, guaranteeing its territorial integrity. Yet these reforms also created new tensions. Conservatives viewed them with suspicion, while many Muslims resented the new equality granted to non-Muslim minorities, who often benefited from their connections to European merchants. The empire also took on massive foreign debt to finance modernization, gradually losing its financial independence. This reached a crisis in 1875 when the government declared partial bankruptcy, leading European powers to establish the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, which gave foreign creditors direct control over significant portions of Ottoman revenues. During this time, new intellectual currents emerged. A group known as the Young Ottomans advocated for constitutional government and greater political freedoms, seeking to reconcile Islamic principles with modern political concepts. This led to the brief triumph of constitutional government in 1876, when the new Sultan Abdülhamid II promulgated the first Ottoman constitution, establishing a parliament with representatives from throughout the empire. This experiment, however, was short-lived. Using a disastrous war with Russia as justification, Abdülhamid suspended the constitution and began a period of personal autocratic rule that would last for 3 decades, a final, desperate attempt to hold the fracturing empire together through the will of a single powerful sovereign. For 33 years, from 1876 until his deposition in 1909, Sultan Abdülhamid II ruled over a declining but still vast empire. In response to the immense challenges he faced, he developed a distinctive and paradoxical approach to governance. While he had suspended the liberal constitution, his reign was not a simple return to the past. It was a complex blend of modernizing autocracy and emphasis on Islamic identity and repressive measures against dissent. Abdülhamid made effective use of modern technology to strengthen his central control. He expanded the telegraph network, allowing him to maintain direct communication with his provincial officials and receive intelligence from across his domains almost instantaneously. He employed photography to document public works and project an image of imperial power and progress. The railway system grew substantially, most notably with the construction of the Hejaz Railway to connect Damascus with the holy city of Medina, improving both economic integration and military mobility. Educational reforms also continued, producing a new generation of technically trained Ottoman officials, officers, and professionals. The Sultan emphasized his role as caliph, the religious leader of Sunni Muslims worldwide, more than his predecessors had done. This pan-Islamic policy served multiple purposes. It strengthened loyalty among his diverse Muslim subjects, from Arabs to Albanians to Kurds. It positioned the empire as the protector of Muslims living under colonial rule beyond its borders. And it countered European influence by appealing to a powerful sense of religious solidarity. Yet alongside these modernizing innovations came growing repression. Censorship of the press tightened, political opposition was ruthlessly suppressed, and an extensive network of spies and informants monitored potential dissidents. Liberal intellectuals fled into exile, continuing their advocacy for constitutional government from the relative safety of Paris, Geneva, and Cairo. The most significant opposition movement to emerge during this period was the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, commonly known as the Young Turks. Growing from student activism at the empire's military and medical academies, this movement initially brought together a diverse group of individuals, Turks, Arabs, Albanians, and others. United by their opposition to Abdülhamid's autocracy and their commitment to restoring the constitution, the Young Turks established secret cells throughout the empire and among exile communities, gradually building a powerful network that extended deep into the officer corps of the Ottoman army. In the summer of 1908, the long-simmering tensions finally erupted into revolution. Ottoman army units in Macedonia, led by Young Turk officers, revolted against the central government. Facing the prospect of a full-blown civil war, Abdülhamid reluctantly restored the 1876 constitution and allowed for elections. The Young Turk Revolution triggered a momentary, beautiful euphoria across the empire. Muslims, Christians, and Jews celebrated together in the streets in public displays of a newfound Ottoman unity and constitutional patriotism. This restored constitutional era, however, quickly revealed deep and intractable tensions. A counter-revolutionary movement attempted to reverse the changes the following spring, but was ultimately crushed. Abdülhamid II was deposed in favor of his brother Mehmed, who became a constitutional monarch with limited powers. The Committee of Union and Progress gradually consolidated its control over the government, evolving from a revolutionary organization into a political party with increasingly authoritarian tendencies. External crises further complicated this turbulent period. Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina. Italy invaded and annexed the Ottoman provinces in Libya. And most devastatingly, the Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913 swept away nearly all remaining Ottoman territories in Europe. Only a small foothold around Istanbul remained of the empire's once vast European domains. These crushing defeats discredited the CUP government but also strengthened the hand of its more radical nationalist elements. A triumvirate of powerful leaders, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha emerged, steering Ottoman policy in an increasingly Turkish nationalist direction. The liberal, multi-ethnic vision of the early Young Turk movement gave way to a more centralizing, Turkish-oriented approach, alienating the Arab, Albanian, and other non-Turkish elites who had initially supported the constitutional revolution. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Ottoman Empire had undergone a profound and painful transformation. As the summer of 1914 dawned and Europe moved inexorably toward catastrophe, the empire stood at its final, fateful crossroads. On a warm summer day in 1914, two ships appeared on the horizon of Istanbul. They were the German battlecruiser Goeben and the light cruiser Breslau, pursued by British naval forces. They sought refuge in neutral Ottoman waters. Their arrival would alter the course of history. The Ottoman leaders made the fateful decision to allow these vessels into the Dardanelles, a violation of international neutrality. The ships were ostensibly purchased for the Ottoman Navy, renamed the Yavuz Sultan Selim and the Midilli, and their German crews now donned fezzes as supposed Ottoman sailors. These powerful warships, anchored in the Golden Horn, symbolized the empire's drift toward the Central Powers in the opening days of World War I. This was not the empire's first choice. When war erupted in August, the initial Ottoman position was neutrality. The empire was exhausted from the Balkan Wars just a year earlier, but several factors pushed the empire toward Germany. The ruling triumvirate had grown deeply suspicious of Russian, British, and French intentions. Enver Pasha, the dynamic minister of war, was an admirer of German military efficiency and believed in Germany's ultimate victory. On August 2, 1914, he signed a secret Ottoman-German alliance. The final step toward war came in late October when these Ottoman warships, still under the command of their German officers, bombarded Russian ports in the Black Sea. Russia declared war, followed shortly by Britain and France. The Sultan Caliph declared a jihad, a holy war, against the Allied powers. Thus began the most devastating war in Ottoman history, a conflict that would ultimately bring about its dissolution. The conflict began disastrously. Enver Pasha personally led an ambitious winter offensive against Russian forces in the Caucasus, which ended in the catastrophe at the Battle of Sarikamish, where an entire Ottoman army was lost to harsh weather and Russian resistance. This defeat had profound and tragic consequences. Fearing a potential uprising among the Armenian population in the region, the Ottoman government ordered their deportation from the war zone. What followed was one of the darkest episodes in late Ottoman history, as the deportation devolved into a campaign of massacres and forced marches that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Armenians, an event many historians and governments now classify as a genocide. While the Eastern Front descended into tragedy, another drama unfolded at the Dardanelles. The British and French, seeking to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, launched an amphibious invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula in April 1915. What was intended as a swift operation turned into a bloody, 9-month stalemate. Ottoman defenders, led by a previously little-known officer named Mustafa Kemal, held their ground with incredible courage and tenacity against forces from Britain, France, Australia, and New Zealand. The campaign ultimately failed and the Allied forces evacuated. It was a stunning defensive victory for the Ottomans that boosted national morale and made Mustafa Kemal a military hero. Elsewhere, the war dragged on. In Mesopotamia, British forces eventually captured Baghdad. But perhaps most consequential for the empire's future was the Arab Revolt, which began in 1916. Sharif Hussein of Mecca, motivated by Arab nationalist aspirations and encouraged by British promises of post-war independence, led an uprising against Ottoman rule. Supported by British officers like T. Lawrence of Arabia, the revolt fractured the Islamic unity of the empire. At the same time, the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France outlined plans to divide the Ottoman Arab territories between themselves, revealing the cynical nature of Allied promises. By the autumn of 1918, after 4 long years of war, the Ottoman Empire was on its knees. Its military casualties approached 1 million men. Its economy had collapsed. Disease and famine were rampant. On October 30, 1918, Ottoman representatives signed the Armistice of Madros, ending their participation in the war. The armistice terms were harsh, and Allied forces soon occupied Istanbul and other key Ottoman territories. The Sultan's government continued to function, but only under foreign supervision. The subsequent Treaty of Sèvres, signed in 1920, effectively dismantled what remained of the empire, reducing it to a small protectorate in central Anatolia. But events had already begun to overtake this punitive settlement. While the Sultan's government in occupied Istanbul reluctantly accepted the Allied dictates, a nationalist resistance movement was forming in the Anatolian interior. Its leader was Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli. He established a rival government in Ankara, effectively creating a dual power situation. The Greek invasion of Western Anatolia, sanctioned by the Allies, galvanized Turkish nationalist sentiment. What followed was the Turkish War of Independence. Nationalist forces fought against Greek, Armenian, and French troops, and in a stunning reversal of fortunes, drove them from Anatolia. These nationalist victories rendered the Treaty of Sèvres obsolete. On November 1, 1922, the Turkish Grand National Assembly in Ankara took a momentous step. It formally abolished the Ottoman Sultanate. Sultan Mehmed VI, the last Ottoman sovereign, left Istanbul aboard a British warship, bringing to an end a dynasty that had ruled for 623 years. The new Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 recognized the new Republic of Turkey as a fully independent and sovereign state. The Caliphate, temporarily retained as a purely religious office, was abolished the following year, severing the last institutional link to the Ottoman past. Thus ended more than 6 centuries of Ottoman rule. An empire that had once dominated 3 continents, controlled the Eastern Mediterranean, and shaped world affairs for centuries, had dissolved amid the ruins of the Great War. Yet from this catastrophic collapse, a new Turkish national identity and state structure had emerged, ready to face the challenges of a new era. As the new Turkish flag rose over Ankara in 1923, the Ottoman Empire had formally ceased to exist. Its territories had been divided, its institutions dismantled, its last sultan exiled. Yet the legacy of 600 years of Ottoman rule could not be so easily erased. The empire had left an indelible imprint on the lands it had governed, shaping everything from borders to architecture, cuisine to music, religious practices to cultural identities. The most immediate heir was the Republic of Turkey under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, soon to be granted the surname Ataturk, father of the Turks. He embarked on a breathtakingly rapid revolution, transforming what had been the Ottoman heartland into a modern, secular nation-state. He abolished the caliphate, closed religious schools, and replaced Ottoman law with a new civil code based on European models. Most dramatically, in 1928, the Arabic script used for writing Turkish for centuries was replaced with a modified Latin alphabet, severing a key cultural link to the Ottoman and Islamic past. Yet beneath this revolutionary rhetoric, important continuities persisted. Many institutions of the new republic evolved directly from their late Ottoman predecessors. The army, the bureaucracy, and the educational system all maintained significant Ottoman organizational features. And Ataturk himself, along with most of his associates, was a product of Ottoman military and professional schools shaped by the intellectual currents of the late empire. Beyond Turkey's borders, other successor states developed their own complex relationships with the Ottoman legacy. In the Balkans, national narratives often portrayed the Ottoman period as an era of foreign occupation and oppression. Yet Ottoman influence remained visible in everything from food to music, architecture to vocabulary. In the Arab world, early nationalist movements defined themselves in opposition to Ottoman rule, which they portrayed as Turkish domination. But in later years, some Arab intellectuals began to reevaluate the period more positively, recognizing it as an era of relative regional integration and Islamic governance that preceded European colonialism. In physical terms, the Ottoman legacy remains highly visible. Architectural masterpieces, from imperial mosques in Istanbul to frontier fortresses in the Balkans, testify to Ottoman power and artistic achievement. The culinary legacy proved particularly durable. Dishes like dolma, borek, baklava, and kofta appear with regional variations throughout former Ottoman lands. And the ritual of coffee, spread throughout the region during Ottoman times, remains a cornerstone of social life. The fall of the Ottoman Empire coincided with the birth of the modern Middle East, with all its contemporary challenges. The arbitrary borders drawn by European powers, often with little regard for geographic or demographic realities, created states that continue to struggle with questions of legitimacy and identity. Perhaps most poignantly, the Ottoman Empire represents a lost world of pre-national diversity and coexistence. However imperfect, its cities contained mosaics of languages, religions, and cultures interacting in daily life. As we reflect on this legacy today, perhaps the most important insight is the Ottoman Empire's remarkable adaptability. From its origins as a frontier principality to its height as a global power to its final, painful transformations, the Ottoman state continuously evolved in response to changing circumstances. The story of the Ottoman Empire is not simply one of rise and fall, but a complex narrative of cultural synthesis, institutional innovation, and human experience across generations and geographies. In Istanbul, the physical embodiment of this legacy stands in monuments like the Hagia Sophia, which has served as a Byzantine cathedral, an Ottoman mosque, a secular museum, and again as a mosque. Each transformation has added new layers of meaning rather than erasing what came before. This quality characterizes the Ottoman legacy throughout its former domains, where imperial patterns remain visible beneath the structures of modern nation-states. A century after the empire's dissolution, we can now view Ottoman history with greater perspective, neither romanticizing it as a lost golden age nor dismissing it as an era of oppression does justice to its complexity. It was a human institution with all the achievements and failures that implies. Its story deserves to be told with the nuance and respect that 6 centuries of human experience demand. As the sun sets over the Bosphorus, where Europe and Asia nearly touch, where Constantine built his new Rome and Mehmed established his Islamic capital, where the waters carry the whispers of history from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, perhaps we can glimpse something of both the grandeur and the humanity of this remarkable empire that rose, flourished, and fell, leaving an indelible mark on the world we inhabit today. The empire now sleeps in history, its sultans and subjects transformed into museum exhibits and scholarly debates. Yet in countless visible and invisible ways, its deep currents continue to flow through our modern world. And so our journey through the long and storied history of the Ottoman Empire comes to a close, not with a definitive judgment, but with an invitation to a deeper, more thoughtful understanding.